Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Van Bunschoten. I'm speaking to you from Sanctuary Hill in Mid-City, Los Angeles. I hope you're having a good day. In the last lecture on the Great Depression, the early part of the Great Depression between 1929 and 1933, I talked a little bit about the causes of the Great Depression. I mentioned the recent recession that we've had in 2008 to 2013 because I want you to start thinking of comparing and contrasting these two downturns in the economy. I showed you a slide that revealed information about Apple and its stock prices. And my point in showing it to you was to argue that our information now about stocks is so much more improved. We have so much more information. This is the age of big data, obviously. But part of the reason why we have the big data is because of what occurred in the Great Depression. There was a lack of financial information about companies, about stock prices, about capitalization, about really every facet of a business and businesses. We have almost too much information now, but it was probably that ignorance back in 1929 about the value of companies and what they were offering the public that led to the downturn. There were many other reasons. In this lecture, what I'd like to do is to talk about the human cost and to continue on and talk about what Herbert Hoover did about the problems that were created by the Great Depression. All right, I mentioned, or I think I left the last lecture showing you this image of a Hooverville. These were commonplace throughout the United States, and they were a constant reminder to Hoover of the problems that his administration faced and that they never really solved. Here's an image of homeless brothers, as they were called, hobos. They had a lot of different names, right? But they seem, in this photo at least, rather nonchalant, relaxed. You can see the fire. They're in a circle around the fire. In the back is their transportation. They would hop on railroads and cover the country in search of work, in search of brotherhood and friendship. And there was a whole culture of the hobo that arose. Language. Hobos would leave signs in towns and villages when they would leave, alerting other hobos to homes in that town that gave out free, that gave out bread, that gave out food, that maybe offered work to hobos. So an entire community and an entire culture really rose up at this time. All right, the human cost. What was the human cost of the early years of the Great Depression? And the early years were probably the most severe. One was vagrancy, right? Vagrancy shot up as families were evicted. So people began to just loiter about. They had nowhere to go. There was no work, or very little. That also meant, of course, that crime increased. People with idle hands tend to look at other people's property in a different way. And so we have hard evidence that with the criminal statistics at the time, that assaults, burglary, robbery, all of these things shot up. Many families planted gardens in order to make up for the money they didn't have to buy that food in the grocery stores. They also canned more of their food. The food that they tended to grow, they bought old bread. They used cardboard and cotton for shoe soles. They went without, not 1 year, not 2 years, sometimes 3, 4, 5 years, if not longer. You never threw anything away. And that's, I think, one of the consequences of the Great Depression that maybe seems small, but I think is enduring. I know that my grandmother, for instance, lived through the Great Depression as a middle-aged woman. She was in, I believe, her early 30s, most of her 30s, I guess, during the Depression. And one of the strongest memories I have of her is that when we would be out walking, she would find things on the ground and she would put them in her pocket. They'd be odd pieces of metal, for instance. They might be a wriggly gum, gum, what do you call it, a wrapper. The wrappers tended to have wax paper on one side and aluminum on the other. She would peel the aluminum off and save the aluminum. And she would eventually add it to this ball, this growing ball of aluminum that she was making. And I would ask her, one time I asked her, why are you doing this? She said, well, it's always valuable. These things all have their value and they might come in handy later. You never know what might happen. And of course, that's exactly what a person says and they've suffered through a cataclysm that has blindsided them, and that was the Great Depression. No one saw it coming. No one prepared for it. So many families, in order to cushion the deprivations caused by the Depression, the unemployment, planted their own gardens, and that was definitely true of my grandparents. Many did without milk or meat. Now remember, they had done without milk during the war and without meat, right? Meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. But now this was enforced by hard necessity. Many of them went without medical care or dental care. Preventative care was unthinkable. Basically, getting hold of a doctor was a luxury that few could afford. The Great Depression in Europe. Now, the human cost. I've talked a little bit about the human cost in the United States, but I really want to make clear that the Great Depression was a global matter, even though it was triggered by events in New York, right in Wall Street in October of 1929. But the events spread far out and they affected Europe, and many would argue, and I think rightly, that the Great Depression eventually is one of the causes of World War II. And what do I mean by that? Well, look on the right there, you see an image of a man. He has a wheelbarrow, and in the wheelbarrow is a neat stack of Deutschmarks. This is a German man during the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was one of the governments really, in interwar Europe, interwar Germany after World War I. And you see what happened to the price of marks here in this box below that image. He has, by the way, that wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks. You needed about that much probably to buy a loaf of bread or to buy a few vegetables. In other words, German currency was practically worthless. Now, its worthlessness was a cause of much larger things than the Great Depression, but the Depression worsened the currency situation in Germany. You see in this box below this photo, you see sort of the price. This is German marks needed to buy 1 ounce of gold. And you see in 1919 it was 170. In 1922, 30,000. In 1923, just 4 years later, 87 billion marks to buy 1 ounce of gold. And that is another way of saying that the Deutschmarks were worthless. And what was true of Germany was not true of all countries, but all countries suffered from sort of the legacy of World War I. They were, in many cases, politically unstable. Their economies had a much harder time transitioning from wartime to peacetime. Throughout all of this, America was the creditor nation. It extended loans, which gets us to this slide. In 1918, President Wilson sought a peace without victors. Remember his 14 points, and remember how optimistic they were. Wilson talked about self-determination. He talked about keeping Germany whole and intact and helping it to rejoin the Brotherhood of Nations. That was very optimistic, but we know what happened to his 14 points. All of them were shot down, and the one that he valued most, the League of Nations, wasn't even passed by his own Senate, by Congress of the United States. So the Treaty of Versailles was seen as punitive. It imposed upon Germany $32 billion in reparations. Reparations, basically a penalty, right? On Germany for causing the war and causing all the havoc that followed. Now, could Germany pay $32 billion? No, it couldn't. It, like many European countries, looked to the United States for help, and the United States, to some extent, helped. It extended loans. They would eventually lose almost all of those loans when the stock market crashed. Another thing that was imposed on Germany besides the reparations, that it was to be disarmed. Its army was to be cut practically by 75%, and it would lose certain parts of its territory, one of the most important being Alsace-Lorraine. This didn't sit well with Germany, of course. Many people saw the Treaty of Versailles as punitive, as a way of getting back, of revenging, European powers revenging themselves upon the Hun, as they called it. Because of the hyperinflation, in other words, because of what was happening here on the right with the devaluation of the currency, the US tried to bully up the German economy and really all the European economies because it was trading with those economies. It had an interest in keeping them healthy. It could only go so far, though. The US extended loans to Germany, but it did not forgive loans to Germany. And so the onus of the war, the onus of that $32 billion remained firmly on Germany's back throughout this entire period, the interwar period. By 1932, with the start of the Depression, 3 years in actually, Germany and the rest of Europe could not repay its loans to the United States. And of course, the United States was in desperate need of the money it had extended to these countries. And therefore, everyone suffered. All right, so that's Europe. Now, in certain places in Europe, in France and in Southern Europe, things were not as bad as they were in the United States. The history of the Great Depression in Europe is a fascinating story, but I wanted to give you certain highlights of it here to show again how interconnected the economy was, and how the United States played an important role. It was a linchpin in that global economy, so that when the United States began to go down, it brought other economies down with it. Getting back to the United States, going to California, people, of course, were losing their jobs, particularly in the countryside. They were losing their farms. And so they would take the one thing that they could carry with them that rolled, their Model T, their runabout, and this is what you see in the photograph, and they would hit the road. This is a family probably of Okies. Okies were from Oklahoma, as you might have imagined. Some were from Kansas and Nebraska, and they all sort of fell under this general rubric. If you came from the Midwest, you were an Okie. Many of them, of course, headed westward to California. Why? Because in the Central Valley, there were jobs. In a country that had very few jobs, there were at least some jobs, picking grapes, harvesting beets and lettuce and spinach, what have you. In any case, you see, this is a family. You see the 4 children in the front, one very, very young, sort of one arm around his mother's leg, the mother with her bonnet here. You see the father looking on in his overalls. And then you see probably their only valuable possession, besides maybe photographs, and that is the runabout. The Model T was a hotel. It was a mode of transportation. It was the only capital that these people had, the only asset. So it was extremely valuable. And remember, the Model T and cars like this hadn't appeared until about 1911, 1912. These were newly bought for the most part. They were less than 20 years old. And these were the most dear possessions that these people owned. And they were critical for the survival of these people, for helping them to find work. Another photograph, the dispossessed. This is a picture of what appears to me to be a Mexican or Mexican-American family, and probably migrant workers. I don't have information about this. You see them posed. You see the men kind of jauntily posed here. Their hats sit back on their heads. You see the women in the background here, these young women. You see a few children, 3, and you have this sort of middle-aged man on the left. Notice the walls. They have Hoover blankets, as they were called, newspaper. Newspaper served various functions. The most common was as insulation. You would stuff it into shoes that were old and that needed to be replaced, only you couldn't replace them, right? You had no cash. So you'd stuff them in there. And believe it or not, paper is very insulating. It does keep in the warmth. They would also use it, as you see here, as wallpaper, sort of a cheap form of wallpaper, anything to sort of break up the monotony, right? And the stains of the walls of these hovels of, this probably shack that probably borders a field, I'm guessing. Anyway, not many possessions here. And notice their clothes too, plain, nothing showy here. Which brings us to another consequence of the early years of the Great Depression. Not only were people dispossessed, not only were they on the roads looking for work, carrying all they had in Model Ts, but there were other people, veterans, of course, who were also suffering. The veterans had at least one ace in the hole, and that ace in the hole was that in 1924, they had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I. The U.S. government was going to give them $1.50 for every day that they spent abroad and $1 for every day they spent in service, usually in the United States or on transit. And that was a bonus given to them in 1924 when, of course, the economy was quite healthy. The patriotic nation extended it and made one qualification to that, which is that they could collect this bonus only in 1945, so they had to wait. They had to wait about, 21 years. Well, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, things worsened. Veterans felt it like anyone else, but they had this bonus. Many remembered it. And in 1932, they got together and they said, let us march on Washington and demand the bonus and argue that because of our service to our country in preserving democracy, that it should be given early. And that seems eminently doable. Why not do that, especially when there was such desperate need among the veterans? And in this photo, you see some of those veterans. They're eating here. They have plates. They're sitting on the ground. This is actually a shot of one of their encampments. They eventually gathered to the number of about 15,000. They gathered in Washington, D.C., and they sat in the shadow of Congress, and they demanded to be paid their bonus. They created camps like this. They were orderly. They were clean. And you see just how orderly they were. Again, these tents side by side, how regular they are. They put their demand to Congress, and Congress had to pass a law in order for them to receive their bonuses. Well, that law was passed very easily in the House. But when it came to the Senate on June 17th, 1932, when the vote was taken, the Senate voted it down. And as you might imagine, there could have been problems here. The men, for the most part, had been very orderly. There had not been commotion. They, in a sense, had policed themselves. No one knew what to expect when the Senate made their vote. For a month afterward, from June 17th to July 17th, there was basically mourning within the camps. And this main camp was Anacostia Flats. This is where the largest contingent of the veterans were, about 10,000. But there were noises and there were rumors of a possible riot and possible violence upon congressmen, upon public officials. This was this size, the size of this army, 15,000 strong, put the fear of God into many people. What was going to happen? In a sense, it was a showdown. The president, on the one hand, Hoover, and the Senate, who refused to extend the bonuses to these men early. And these men. So, what eventually happened? Well, as I said, there was that period of mourning. Here's a photograph of the men, as I said, under the dome of the Capitol, protesting, demonstrating, wanting their bonus. Well, eventually Hoover took control of things, and he called out, first of all, the police, the Washington, D.C. police. They had trouble. 2 men were shot among the protesters. And pretty soon, Hoover realized that there was the potential for a disaster. And remember, this is a year when he was up for re-election. So and there was a lot of politics involved in this. Eventually, he called out the National Reserve, in other words, the Army. And we see this. Further demonstrations, louder demonstrations, and then eventually a breaking up of the camps. And here are, for instance, and this is a shot actually of the policemen at first, before the army came in. But you see the violence. You see that man on the left holding an implement in his hand. He seems to be rushing towards the police. Scenes like this, of course, were Hoover's worst nightmare. Eventually, the camps were burned down. The National Reserve came out. It was headed by 3 men whom you might have heard of before. One of them was Eisenhower. Eisenhower, who was going to lead the expeditionary force into France during World War I, right? The greatest expeditionary force in the history of the world, for that matter, 1944, taking back of France from the Nazis. Another man you might have heard of, perhaps in a very famous movie that won an Academy Award, his name was Patton, George Patton. He's going to go on and defeat Rommel in North Africa. He's eventually going to go up the Italian boot, take one Italian city after another from Mussolini and the Nazi forces, fascist forces, and eventually be hailed as a hero. Another man actually was the head of both of those men. He's the one who gave the commands. His name was Douglas MacArthur, and he's important, or will be important, in the Pacific Theater during World War II. It's MacArthur who's going to step onto the beach in the Philippines and take back the Philippines from the Japanese, and he'll eventually be on the aircraft carrier when the Japanese dignitaries come to sign and to assure that World War II is at an end, the surrender of the Japanese Empire. So that's Douglas MacArthur. In a sense, all of these heroes are here, but they're doing very unheroic things. They're basically fighting themselves, right? It's U.S. soldiers against U.S. soldiers, and that shows you, I think, just how awful the situation was for Hoover. He had already gone through 3 years of trying various means, and we'll talk about some of those means, to end the Depression. All of them had been negligible. They had done almost nothing. And then on top of this, there was this political or this public relation disaster in terms of the bonus army. I mean, it's hard to speak ill of a veteran, isn't it? And politicians today, of course, make it a point to always praise veterans, rightly so, but to praise veterans and to work towards getting them better health care or better situations, housing, etc. So to raise your hand against a veteran is almost a surefire way, of course, to lose the American voter. And that was definitely the case with Hoover. Of course, Hoover probably wasn't going to be reelected anyway. This only confirmed that. Herbert Hoover and the end of prosperity. So now we're getting near the end of his presidency at this point in the lecture, but I want to remind you of something he said in November of 1929, because I think it tells us a lot about Hoover. He said, any lack of confidence, now remember, November 1929 is a month after the stock market crash. He said, any lack of confidence in the economic future or the basic strength of business in the United States is foolish. And that would be the message he would take and repeat endlessly in almost every speech that he gave thereafter, right up until 1933, when he turned over the reins of power to FDR. And what's burned in the minds of many Americans because of this is this sort of false prediction. And so they saw Hoover as a liar. They saw Hoover, many people saw Hoover as a Pollyanna, someone who was out of touch with reality. That, of course, is also poison for a president, for an executive. Now, you might ask yourself, what was he going to say? Many people would say that as president, even if the situation is bad, you have to say things. You have to inspire people to do their best in spite of it. And that very often calamities like this are caused not by hard facts on the ground, but by psychology, right? We sort of psych ourselves out, both as individuals and as a nation. And what Hoover was attempting to do was what all good presidents attempt to do, is to inspire the nation. Well, with each succeeding year, as the economic numbers began to plummet, as banks closed, as factories were closed, these words began to ring hollow in the ears of Americans. All right, what did Hoover do? There's been a reevaluation of Hoover over, I would say, the last 20, even 30 years. Why a reevaluation? Because in a sense, the Great Depression marked Hoover as an enemy of the people from the moment it happened practically until about 1965, 1970. It was only when conservatives began to win the White House again, both at the federal level and at the state level, that people began to look at Hoover differently and to try to maybe examine what he actually did or tried to do during the 3 years in the presidency that remained him after the stock market crash. That kind of reevaluation is good. In any case, Hoover tried many things, but it's important to remember that Hoover was, at heart, a conservative of the old school. And the old school said several things. It said that when hard times hit, whether it's a family or whether it's a nation, what you do is you tighten your belt. What you do is you slim down, right? You reduce your expenses so you can begin to cut and lay off people, right? You began to slim down government, reduce regulations, and allow business to recover itself. The idea that the economy is self-correcting, that was very strong in Hoover. He was a laissez-faire capitalist. Another thing that Hoover felt, and again, this gets to, I think, something very deep within him, his ethos, was that you succeeded as an individual, and handouts hurt the individual. Federal handouts, relief, Social Security, anything that smacked of a freebie, encouraged people not to work hard. And so Hoover was not going to offer a social welfare package to Americans. He felt it important in maintaining their character to make sure that the government didn't intrude itself. I don't know, perhaps I'm choosing my words too carefully here. Hoover believed in the independence of the individual, that they should be allowed to both succeed and fail. In any case, knowing those basic assumptions, Hoover put into place tariffs, or what goes by the name of protectionism, and they were called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Tariffs, again, are always a measure employed in order to help the domestic economy, domestic businesses, compete against foreign businesses. Another thing he did was to create a new corporation, or an arm of the federal government. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And its job was to make loans not to Americans directly. That would be a handout. What instead he proposed was to offer something like $2 billion to insurance companies, banks, and credit unions, so that they then would make the decision how that money was to be distributed among the deserving poor, or those Americans that were willing to work but were unable to find work, whose businesses were crippled but not dead. And so what we learned from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is that it did too little, too late. It didn't give enough of that money. I think it distributed about $61 million of that $2 billion. That's a very small amount. And again, it shows that even though Hoover had taken the step of offering federal money in order to jumpstart the economy, I don't think his heart was really in it. He believed in associationalism, and associationalism is the idea that businesses should regulate themselves, but that government had a very important part, that it should partner with business, and the two should work together. But it should never be the government taking the first step. That is, if you want to jumpstart the steel industry, it's important that steel industry, the steel factories and businessmen should take the lead. The federal government is seen as sort of a assistant or a facilitator in that. That's associationalism. Public works. Hoover was reluctant to establish institute public works because, again, he felt that these were handouts. These were federal projects, and the federal government should stay at the side and let private business take over. But as the catastrophe deepened, he began to move on certain projects that improved American infrastructure. In other words, bridges, roads, and dams, Hoover Dam being perhaps the most important of these projects. It starts under Hoover, it's completed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Anyway, this again was a little too late in helping people out, at least during his presidency. He wanted to not increase taxes, right? He wanted to leave that cash in the pockets of Americans. That's what most conservatives believed then. That's what they believe now. But he very reluctantly, near the end of his presidency, began to increase taxes to balance the budget. Even the federal budget began to suffer. All of these measures, as you can see, were sort of a broad attack, or I think appear to be a broad attack upon this problem. But as I said, many parts of this program were prosecuted in a very lukewarm way. Hoover said, federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character. And when he said national character, he really meant almost something that was physical, something that you could put your hands on. He considered it to be the most important possession of an American, right? This idea that character would help you regardless of whatever situation was occurring, whatever the circumstances were. It had helped him. He spoke from personal experience. He started out in a poor family, and he had worked and labored hard in order to get himself into Stanford, and then once in Stanford, had worked extremely hard to graduate and to become, by his own sweat and blood, a millionaire. Quite a story. I mean, rags to riches story. Hoover embodied that. Therefore, the man could not unmake himself. And you see this in his programs. All right, the impact of the Great Depression on various groups. There were many, of course, who were suffering in many different ways. You see the image on the left. You see a group of African Americans standing in line with baskets and bags, and one man has a pail in his hand. And ironically, in the background, they're probably waiting in line, of course, to get bread, to get handouts of some sort. And this is probably in a city as well. Behind them, in a huge billboard, you see a family in a car, a shiny new car, by the way, dressed in probably the latest fashion. The dog, notice on the left, its head out the window. And you see them driving, happily smiling, and the billboard reads, there's no way like the American way, world's highest standard of living. That is thick, acidic irony, if ever there was. This is a soup line in Detroit, Michigan, 1932. What were some of the impacts? Well, there were too many really to label. Let me just hit the higher points. Juvenile delinquency increased because about 200,000 children left their homes. There were no homes in many places in the country. Many of them were devastated. There was no breadwinner. The father had left, the mother had left. People had left, sometimes put their children in the care of others, in the hands of an aunt or an uncle. And of course, the hard times hit these people as well. Therefore, families were in disarray. Homes were being foreclosed. Divorce shot up, as you might expect. Hard times brings out the worst in us, unfortunately. More and more women worked outside the home. Now you might say, well, that's a good thing, and that's probably right. They had to work outside of the home. It wasn't an option. It had nothing to do with feminism. It had to do with getting bread in the mouths of their children. When they did enter the workplace in larger numbers than had ever been seen before, outside of, say, World War I, they faced, of course, widespread discrimination. In many cases, states and cities passed laws forbidding women to hold down jobs outside the home. Men felt that those jobs belonged, of course, to men, to the main breadwinner. So again, the theme of patriarchy, the theme of sexual discrimination, is always with us in American history. And we see it particularly in this dark period. Unemployment shot up among African Americans to 50%. In other words, 1 out of every 2 African Americans looking for work were jobless. That is an incredible statistic, incredibly sad statistic as well. Does anyone know what it is now, for instance, employment for African Americans? I think recently I heard that it was 31% or 28%, somewhere in there. So 1 out of 3. Now we're not suffering through a Great Depression. Think about that, though. Think about these numbers. Say goodbye to the family farm. One of the impacts of the Great Depression is that it practically wiped out small family-owned farms. 750,000 farms went bankrupt. And they were under the double blow, not simply of the Great Depression, but of the Dust Bowl as well, which lasted 6 years, 1931 to 37. The Dust Bowl hit mostly in Oklahoma, in Kansas, in Nebraska, in eastern Colorado. Private charities were left basically to help these poor. And in this photo that I have on the left, these people might be lining up, of course, to the door of a church. Churches gave out food, they gave out clothes, they did whatever they could. They were overwhelmed, like everyone was, overwhelmed by the deserving and the undeserving poor. That distinction, by the way, became a talking point in the 30s, a point of controversy. Who were the deserving poor? Should only the deserving poor get get free bread, get clothes? Or is this sort of a national disaster? And we're all sort of in this boat together. So the whole question about why we're poor, who's guilty, who deserves to be blamed about losing their home. I mean, this created an immense amount of guilt. The psychological impact of the Great Depression is unquantifiable and enormous. All right, this leads us to the end of our lecture. I want to thank you for hanging in there. Some key points about the early days of the Great Depression. Before I talk about these, sort of a side note, there's a sort of tiredness in my voice you might have heard when I talk about the Great Depression. I'm sorry for it, but my grandparents went through the Great Depression, and one of the saddest memories I have is I've already mentioned my grandmother would keep things. She would not throw anything away, and I said this was part of the legacy of the Great Depression. Another one was the silence that my grandmother had towards the Great Depression. In other words, she refused to talk about this period in her life. I didn't know my grandfather that well, but from what I know of him, he probably would speak less about the Great Depression if he had lived. Um, my grandmother didn't talk about it. It was a shameful period in her life. She lost her house. She and her husband lost her house. They had to go and live with, I believe, her husband's family. But that didn't work out very well. It was not the best arrangement. They, as I said, grew their own food to a great extent when the Depression was over because of World War II. My grandfather immediately bought a farm. Why? Because he felt that regardless of what happened, if you had a farm, you could grow your own food, right? Eventually, you could at least bunker down and survive. And so he knew something, I think, critical about the Great Depression, which I've tried, I think, to sort of slip in here in my lecture, which is that the people in the countryside, even though they were poor, they had means of surviving. They had strategies of surviving, the ability to grow their own food, a store of food, for instance. They had chickens, they had goats, they had cattle. They could have access to milk, other things that people in the city didn't have. Anyway, my grandfather knew that. Anyway, moving on, let's end up with some of these key points. First one is no one saw it coming, okay, when we talk about it as a historian. And now you in a sense are amateur historians. When you think about the Great Depression, always remember that people didn't know it was a Great Depression. That name for it only came afterwards, that label. When the downturn occurred, they believed Hoover. They had no reason not to believe Hoover. Every downturn had led to a recovery within a couple of years at least. There had been some daylight to keep people going. Not so with this Great Depression. So no one saw it coming. They were walking in the dark always. And so as year followed year of depression and bad business numbers and foreclosures and joblessness, the country began to become numb. In hindsight, through the eyes of history, we see that there were several signs that a Great Depression was on the horizon. And I tried to point out some of these signs. For instance, the maldistribution of wealth in the country. That was an important one. The lack of accurate, reliable financial information or data. That's something we take for granted today. And that's only because of the Depression, really, that we probably have it. Along with bank failures, job loss, plummeting wages, and foreclosures, Americans suffered psychologically. Shame and guilt were an unquantifiable consequence of the crash. That needs to be said again. Shame and guilt were an unquantifiable consequence of the crash. You know, I started with mentioning the recession of 2008. Not much has changed between the two periods, I say. Why? Because many of the people who lost their homes in 2008 didn't feel that they lost them because of the system, because of capitalism. They felt, many of them, that it was their fault. It was their lack of foresight or their inability to work hard, whatever it might be, but they blame themselves. And that's very unfortunate. Of course, in some cases, it's partly true. History is complicated. But no one could have controlled the market. No one could have opted out of the market in many ways, I would say in the last recession. What's true, I think, of many Americans at any point in American history is that we are part of larger forces. And if you're lucky, you can navigate those larger forces better, perhaps, than others. And those who succeed and survive depressions are not necessarily those who are necessarily virtuous or hardworking or frugal. By 1933, Hoover, relying on tax cuts and budget cutting and brave language, made little headway against the deepening economic disaster, which brings us to 1933. It's a presidential election year. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democrat, is running against Herbert Hoover, who's running for a second term. One person said that they probably could have run almost anyone against Herbert Hoover, a monkey, and that monkey would have been elected president of the United States. Dark humor. When we pick it up again, we'll talk about the New Deal, a way of tackling the problems that we've just explored in this lecture. Have a good day.